Brr. You know these shawls that are usually on the back? Got 3 of them on. One from Elisa, one from Tank, one from Steve. Just have a t-shirt on underneath it. It was right warm earlier today, but woo-hoo. Well, let's get on with it, shall we? And y'all help me pray. I know you're watching it after the fact. I can stay awake. Alright, let me back up a little bit. I don't even remember this. Okay, because I was at the wrong place. Okay, we're at part 4, which you might see on the thing, or it probably says the end of chapter whatever. That afternoon we were to go to tea with Miss Emily Barton at her rooms in the village. We strolled down there on foot, for I felt strong enough now to manage the hill back again. We must actually have allowed too much time and got there early, for the door was opened to us by a tall, raw-boned, fierce-looking woman who told us that Miss Barton wasn't in yet. But she's expecting you, I know, so if you'll come up and wait, please. This was evidently faithful Florence. We followed her up the stairs, and she threw open a door and showed us into what was quite a comfortable sitting room, though perhaps a little over-furnished. Some of the things I suspected had come from little furs. The woman was clearly proud of her room. It's nice, isn't it? She demanded. Very nice, said Joanna warmly. I make her as comfortable as I can. Not that I can do for her as I'd like to, and in the way she ought to have. She ought to be in her own house, properly, not turned out into rooms. Florence, who was clearly a dragon, looked from one to the other of us reproachfully. It was not, I felt, our lucky day. Joanna had been ticked off by Amy Griffith and Partridge, and now we were both being ticked off by the dragon Florence. Parlor maid I was for 15 years there, she added. Joanna, goaded by injustice, said, well, Miss Barton wanted to let the house. She put it down at the house agent's. Forced to it, said Florence, and she living so frugal and careful. But even then, the government can't leave her alone, has to have its pound of flesh just the same. I shook my head sadly. Plenty of money there was in the old lady's time, said Florence. And then they all died off, one by one, poor dears. Miss Emily nursing of them one after the other. Wore herself out, she did, and always so patient and uncomplaining. But it told on her, and then to have worry about money on top of it all. Shares not bringing in what they used to, so she says, and why not, I should like to know. They ought to be ashamed of themselves doing down a lady like her who's got no head for figures and can't be up to their tricks. Practically everyone has been hit that way, I said, but Florence remained unsoftened. It's all right for some as can look after themselves, but not for her. She needs looking after, and as long as she's with me, I'm going to see. No one imposes on her, upsets her in any way. I'd do anything for Miss Emily. And glaring at us for some moments in order to drive that point thoroughly home, the indomitable Florence left the room, carefully shutting the door behind her. Do you feel like a bloodsucker, Jerry? Inquired Joanna. Because I do. What's the matter with us? We don't seem to be going down very well, I said. Megan gets tired of us. Partridge disapproves of you. Faithful Florence disapproves of both of us." Joanna murmured, "I wonder why Megan did leave. She got bored." "I don't think she did at all. I wonder, do you think, Jerry, it could have been something that Amy Griffith said?" "You mean this morning when they were talking on the doorstep?" "Yes, there wasn't much time, of course, but—" I finished the sentence, "but that woman's got the tread of a cow elephant. She might have—" The door opened and Miss Emily came in. She was pink and a little out of breath and seemed excited. Her eyes were very blue and shining. She chirruped at us in quite a distracted manner. "Oh dear, I'm so sorry I'm late. Just doing a little shopping in the town. And the cakes at the Blue Rose didn't seem to me quite fresh, so I went on to Mrs. Liggins. I always like to get my cakes the last thing, then one gets the newest batch out of the oven, and one isn't put off with the day befores. But I'm so distressed I've kept you waiting, really unpardonable." Joanna cut in, "It's our own fault, Miss Barton. We're early. We walk down and Jerry strides along so fast now that we arrive everywhere too soon." "Never too soon, dear. Don't say that. One cannot have too much of a good thing, you know." And the old lady patted Joanna affectionately on the shoulder. Joanna brightened up at last, so it seemed. She was being a success. Emily Barton extended her smile to include me, but with a slight timidity in it, rather as one might approach a man-eating tiger, guaranteed for the moment harmless. "It's very good of you to come to such a feminine meal as tea, Mr. Burton." Emily Barton, I think, has a mental picture of men as interminably consuming whiskeys and sodas and smoking cigars, and in the intervals dropping out to do a few seductions of village maidens or to conduct a liaison with married women. When I said this to Joanna later, she replied that it was probably wishful thinking, that Emily Barton would have liked to come across such a man, but alas, had never done so. In the meantime, Miss Emily was fussing round the room, arranging Joanna and myself with little tables, and carefully providing ashtrays, and a minute later the door opened, and Florence came in bearing a tray of tea with some fine Crown Derby cups on it, which I gathered Miss Emily had brought with her. The tea was china and delicious, and there were plates of sandwiches and thin bread and butter and a quantity of little cakes. Florence was beaming now and looked at Miss Emily with a kind of maternal pleasure, as at a favorite child enjoying a doll's tea party. Joanna and I ate far more than we wanted to. Our hostess pressed us so earnestly. The little lady was clearly enjoying her tea party, and I perceived that, to Emily Barton, Joanna and I were a big adventure. Two people from the mysterious world of London and sophistication. Naturally, our talk soon dropped into local channels. Miss Barton spoke warmly of Dr. Griffith, his kindness and his cleverness as a doctor. Mr. Symington, too, was a very clever lawyer and had helped Miss Barton to get some money back from the income tax, which she would never have known about. He was so nice to his children, too, devoted to them, and to his wife. She called herself up. Poor Mrs. Symington, it's so dreadfully sad, and those young children left motherless. Never, perhaps, a strong woman, and her health had been bad of late. A brainstorm, that is what it must have been. I read about such a thing in the paper. People really do not know what they're doing under those circumstances, and she can't have known what she was doing, or else she would have remembered Mr. Symington and the children. That anonymous letter must have shaken her up very badly, said Joanna. Miss Barton flushed. She said with a tinge of reproof in her voice, "Not a very nice thing to discuss, do you think, dear? I know there have been letters, but we won't talk about the nasty things. I think they're better just ignored." "Well, Miss Barton may be able to ignore them, but for some people it wasn't so easy. However, I immediately changed the subject, and we discussed Amy Griffith." "Wonderful, quite wonderful," said Emily Barton. "Her energy and her organizing powers are really splendid. She's so good with the girls, too, and she's so practical and up to date. In every way, she really runs this place, and absolutely devoted to her brother. It's very nice to see such devotion between brother and sister." "Doesn't he ever find her a little overwhelming?" asked Joanna. Emily Barton stared at her in a startled fashion. "She sacrificed a great deal for his sake," she said with a touch of reproachful dignity. I saw a touch of "oh, yay" in Joanna's eye, and hastened to divert the conversation to Mr. Pye. Emily Barton was a little dubious about Mr. Pye. All she could say was, repeated rather doubtfully, that he was very kind, yes, very kind, very well off too, and most generous. He had very strange visitors sometimes, but then of course he had traveled a lot. We agreed that travel not only broadened the mind, but occasionally resulted in the forming of strange acquisitions. "I've often wished myself to go on a cruise," said Emily Barton wistfully. "One reads about them in the papers, and they sound so attractive." "Why don't you go?" asked Joanna. This turning of a dream into reality seemed to alarm Miss Emily. "Oh, no, that would be quite impossible." "But why? They're fairly cheap." "Oh, it's not only the expense, but I shouldn't like to go alone. Traveling alone would look very peculiar, don't you think?" "No," said Joanna. Miss Emily looked at her doubtfully. "And I don't know how I would manage about my luggage and going ashore at foreign ports and all the different currencies." Innumerable pitfalls seemed to rise up before the little lady's affrighted gaze, and Joanna hastened to calm her by a question about an approaching garden fete and sale of work. This led us quite naturally to Mrs. Dane Calthrop. A faint spasm showed for a minute on Miss Barton's face. "You know, dear," she said, "she is really a very odd woman. The things she says sometimes." I asked what things. "Oh, I don't know. Such very unexpected things. And the way she looks at you, as though you weren't there, but somebody else was. I'm expressing it badly, but it's hard to convey the impression I mean. And then she won't, interfere at all. There's so many cases where a vicar's wife could advise and perhaps admonish. Pull people up, and make them mend their ways, because people would listen to her, I'm sure of that. They're all quite in awe of her, but she insists on being aloof and far away, and has such a curious habit of feeling sorry for the most unworthy people." "That's interesting," I said, exchanging a quick glance with Joanna. "Still, she is a very well-bred woman. She was a Miss Fairway of Belpath, very good family, and these old families sometimes are a little peculiar, But she is devoted to her husband, who's a man of very fine intellect, wasted, I'm sometimes afraid, in this country circle. A good man and most sincere, but I always find his habit of quoting Latin a little confusing. Hear, hear, I said fervently. Jerry had an expensive public school education, so he doesn't recognize Latin when he hears it, said Joanna. This led Miss Barton to a new topic. The school mistress here is a most unpleasant young woman, she said. Quite red, I'm afraid. She lowered her voice over the word red. Later, as we walked home up the hill, Joanna said to me, she's rather sweet. In part 5. At dinner that night, Joanna said to Partridge that she hoped her tea party had been a success. Partridge got rather red in the face and held herself even more stiffly. Thank you, miss, but Agnes never turned up after all. Oh, I'm sorry. It didn't matter to me, said Partridge. It didn't matter to me. She was so swelling with grievance that she condescended to pour it out to us. It wasn't me who thought of asking her. She rang up herself and said she had something on her mind and could she come here, it being her day off, and I said yes, subject to your permission, which I obtained, and after that, not a sound or sign of her. And no word of apology either, though I should hope I'll get a postcard tomorrow morning. These girls nowadays don't know their place, no idea of how to behave. Joanna attempted to soothe Partridge's wounded feelings. She mayn't have felt well. You didn't ring up to find out? Partridge drew herself up again. No, I did not, miss. No, indeed. If Agnes likes to behave rudely, that's her lookout. But I shall give her a piece of my mind when we meet. Partridge went out of the room still stiff with indignation, and Joanna and I laughed. Probably a case of advice from Aunt Nancy's column, I said. My boy is very cold in his manner to me. What shall I do about it? Failing Aunt Nancy, Partridge was to be applied to for advice, but instead there has been a reconciliation, and I expect at this minute that Agnes and her boy are one of those speechless couples locked in each other's arms that you come upon suddenly standing by a dark hedge. They embarrass you horribly, but you don't embarrass them. Joanna laughed and said she expected that was it. We began talking of the anonymous letters and wondered how Nash and the melancholy Graves were getting on. It's a week later exactly, said Joanna, since Mrs. Symington's suicide. I should think they must have got on to something by now, fingerprints or handwriting or something. I answered her absently. Somewhere behind my conscious mind, a queer uneasiness was growing. It was connected in some way with the phrase that Joanna had used. A week, exactly. I ought, I dare say, to have put 2 and 2 together earlier. Perhaps unconsciously my mind was already speechless. Anyway, the leaven was working now. The uneasiness was growing, coming to a head. Joanna noticed suddenly that I wasn't listening to her spirited account of a village encounter. What's the matter, Jerry? I did not answer because my mind was busy piecing things together. Mrs. Symington's suicide. I was alone in the house that afternoon. Alone in the house. Alone in the house because the maids were having their day out a week ago exactly. Jerry, what? I interrupted. Joanna, maids have days out once a week, don't they? And alternate Sundays, said Joanna. What on? Never mind Sundays. They go out about the same day every week. Yes, that's the usual thing. Joanna was staring at me curiously. Her mind had not taken the track mine had done. I crossed the room and rang the bell. Partridge came. Tell me, I said, is this Agnes Waddle or Waddell? She's in service? Yes, sir, at Mrs. Symington's. At Mr. Symington's, I should say now. I drew a deep breath. I glanced at the clock. It was 10:30. Would she be back now, do you think? Partridge was looking disapproving. Yes, sir, the maids have to be in by 10. By 10 there. They're old-fashioned. I said, I'm going to ring up. I went out to the hall. Joanna and Partridge followed me. Partridge was clearly furious. Joanna was puzzled. She said as I was trying to get the number, I think something happened to her. What are you going to do, Jerry? I'd like to be sure that the girl has come in all right. Partridge sniffed. Just sniffed. Nothing more. Nothing more. Doggone it. Okay, but I did not care 2 pence about Partridge's sniffs. Elsie Holland answered the telephone, the other end. Sorry to ring you up, I said. This is Jerry Burton speaking. Has your maid Agnes come in? It was not until after I had said it that I suddenly felt a bit of a fool. For if the girl had come in and it was all right, how on earth was I going to explain my ringing up and asking? It would have been better if I had let Joanna ask the question, though even that would need a bit of explaining. I foresaw a new trail of gossip started in Limstock with myself and the unknown Agnes Waddle at its center. Elsie Holland sounded not unnaturally very much surprised. Agnes? Oh, she's sure to be in by now. I felt a fool, but I went on with it. Do you mind just seeing if she's come in, Miss Holland? There's one thing to be said for a nursery governess. She's used to doing things. She's used to doing things when told. Hers not to reason why. Elsie Holland put down the receiver and went off obediently. 2 minutes later, I heard her voice. Are you there, Mr. Burton? Yes, Agnes isn't in yet, as a matter of fact. I knew then that my hunch had been right. I heard a noise of voices vaguely from the other end. Then Symington himself spoke. Hello, Burton, what's the matter? Your maid Agnes isn't back yet? No, Miss Holland has just been to see. What's the matter? There's not been an accident, has there? Not an accident, I said. Do you mean you have reason to believe something's happened to the girl? I said grimly. I shouldn't be surprised. And that's it. That's the end of chapter 7. So we'll be on 8 hopefully tomorrow. Yay! I stayed awake. Woohoo! Don't take much to make me happy. Now I'm going to go put on my flannel jammies and my house coat. Oh God, I had all these shawls back here. Thank you, lovely people, for sending me shawls. Cat Dancer sent me a beautiful blanket, but it's in the den. And I have more shawls from my sissy and Joyce Swenson and, oh, lordy, bunch of y'all. Oh, sweet people. I got heat. I think I still have it on the air. I need to go see what it's on. I love y'all. Be sweet, don't be ugly. Mwah. See you later. Bye.